They laughed at Leonard Hatch the same way. People laugh at a man who shows up to a rodeo in a suit. Like he didn't understand the room, like he'd wandered into the wrong life by accident. It was a Tuesday morning at Decker's Feed and Supply in Harlan County, Kentucky, and Leonard had just made the mistake of saying out loud what he'd been quietly planning for 6 months. He didn't mean to tell anyone. He'd stopped in for a bag of mineral supplement and a roll of polywire, and Gary Pruitt, who ran 300 cow-calf pairs on the ridge and considered himself the unofficial dean of local cattle knowledge, had spotted the polywire and asked a question that Leonard answered honestly. That was the mistake. You're going to put your whole herd on a strip the size of a basketball court and move them every 2 days? Gary said it slow, the way you repeat something back to a man to let him hear how foolish it sounds. Leonard, those cows are going to eat that to dirt before the week's out. 2 other men at the counter turned around. One of them, Ray Ketterman, who leased the bottom ground along Troublesome Creek, let out a short laugh that wasn't quite a laugh, more like air escaping a tire. The other one just shook his head and looked at the floor the way people do when they're too polite to join in, but don't disagree either. Leonard paid for his supplies and walked out. He didn't explain himself. He didn't argue. He'd learned enough in 53 years to know that some conversations aren't worth having until you have results to point at. Let me tell you about Leonard Hatch. Not the version Gary Pruitt would give you, and not the version Leonard would give you either, 'cause he's too modest for his own good. The real version. The one that starts about 20 years before that morning at Decker's. Leonard had spent 11 years working as a range management specialist for the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, traveling across the eastern Kentucky coal fields and helping landowners who'd had their topsoil scraped off by mining operations try to coax something green back into existence. He'd seen what compacted, depleted land looked like at its absolute worst. He'd also seen what happened when you gave it rest. Not input, not chemicals, not heroic intervention, just rest, water, and time. He'd left the agency in 2008 to come back home and take care of his mother after his father died, and somewhere in those years of watching her decline and sorting through what remained of the family farm, 46 acres his grandfather had cleared by hand, now down to 28 pasture acres after a timber sale, he'd decided he wasn't going to just maintain the place, he was going to fix it. The land was tired. Anyone who walked it could see that. The pasture closest to the barn hadn't had a full stand of grass in years. It was a patchwork of bare dirt, clumps of fescue that the cows had hammered down to nothing, and a slow creep of thistle and ironweed moving in from the fence line, the way an invading army takes ground. Leonard had 18 Angus cows, a bull, and about 23 acres he could actually graze. By any reasonable math, that was marginal. His neighbors ran more cattle on less land and figured that was just how it was in the hill country. You bought hay, a lot of hay. You cursed the dry summers. You sold cows when you had to and bought them back when you could. Leonard had a different idea. He'd been reading everything he could find on adaptive multi-paddock grazing. Alan Savory's work, Greg Judy's operation in Missouri, research out of South Africa and New Zealand. He'd filled 3 composition notebooks with observations and calculations, tracking grass heights, soil temperatures, rainfall, and recovery times with the same systematic attention he'd once used on reclamation projects for the agency. His daughter, Audrey, who lived in Lexington and called on Sunday evenings, had listened to him talk about leaf area index and root mass recovery for so many weeks that she'd started putting him on speaker while she did dishes. "Dad," she told him once, "I believe you. I just think you should also maybe talk to a person about this sometimes." He did. He talked to the extension office. They were politely skeptical. He talked to a veterinarian he trusted over in Perry County, who said he didn't know enough about it to have an opinion, but that the cows would tell him the truth eventually. He talked to his neighbor, Amos Whitfield, who ran a small hay operation on the other side of the ridge and had always struck Leonard as a man who thought before he spoke. Amos listened carefully and then said, "I won't say it won't work. I'll say I don't know." That was good enough for Leonard. In March of that year, Leonard divided his 23 pasture acres into 14 paddocks using a combination of existing fence lines, some new permanent posts, and roughly 1.5 miles of polywire strung on fiberglass rods he could move by hand. Each paddock ended up somewhere between 1 and 2 acres. His cows would graze one paddock for 2 to 3 days, just long enough to take the grass down but not destroy the root system, then move to the next. The math gave his first paddock about 40 days of rest before they came around again. Long enough, by everything he'd read, for the grass to fully recover and build reserves. He kept records the way he'd kept records for the agency, a spiral notebook in his shirt pocket. A cheap weather station mounted on the barn, and a set of grass height measurements he took at the same 10 spots in each paddock every week, without fail. In April, Gary Pruett drove by on the county road and saw the polywire subdivisions and slowed down. Leonard was out moving a temporary strand, and Gary rolled down his window and said something about how it looked like a dog kennel operation, and that he hoped Leonard had enough hay put up to feed those cows when they ran out of room to graze. Leonard waved and went back to work. This is the part of the story that people who've never tried something genuinely new tend not to understand. The critics don't go away when you ignore them. They don't get quieter. They find you at the feed store, and at the gas station, and at church, and they ask how your little experiment is going with a particular tone that tells you they already know how they expect you to answer. Leonard got that question 7 times in the first 2 months. He answered it the same way every time, going all right. He didn't say more because there wasn't much to say yet. The first 2 paddocks looked rough after the cows moved through, chewed down, trampled, bare patches where the cows had loitered near the temporary fence. Leonard stood at the gate of paddock 1 after they'd moved out and looked at it honestly. It didn't look recovered. It looked like a bad haircut. He wrote in his notebook, day 14, P1 still looks rough, seeing first green push at north end near the drainage. Hold. He held. That word, hold, is harder than it sounds when you're watching land you care about look worse before it looks better. When every instinct shaped by a lifetime of farming is telling you that bare dirt is bad and you should do something. When your neighbors are driving by and drawing their own conclusions, Leonard held because the research said hold, and because in 11 years of range work he had learned that the land's timeline is not the farmer's timeline, and the farmer who can't accept that will fight the land forever and lose. By week 7, paddock 1 had come back. Not all the way, not lush, but there was grass where there had been dirt, and the fescue that remained was standing upright and actively growing instead of the prostrate, grazed flat mat he'd looked at for years. The root structure was intact. Leonard got down on one knee and pulled a small handful and looked at the roots and put it back carefully. He did not celebrate. He wrote in his notebook, P1 recovery confirmed, monitoring root depth, do not rush. Audrey came home in June for her birthday, and Leonard walked her through the paddocks, one by one. She'd seen the land her whole life. She didn't need the technical explanation to understand what she was looking at. She stood in paddock 3, which the cows had just vacated, and then walked 20 yards to the gate of the home pasture, which hadn't been subdivided and still looked the way the whole farm used to look. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "That's a big difference." "I know," Leonard said. "Are you going to tell Gary Pruitt?" Leonard thought about it. "Gary'll figure it out," he said, "or he won't." July brought heat, and then August brought drought. Real drought, the kind that turns the county agent's weekly updates from cautiously optimistic to quietly alarmed. Rainfall for the season was running 30% below average. The creek that ran along Leonard's south fence dropped to a trickle by mid-August, and he had to haul water to the lower paddocks twice a week. This is the part where the story should have fallen apart. This is the part where the critics get to say they told you so. They didn't get to say that. Because Leonard's paddocks, with their recovering root systems, and the organic matter that had been accumulating in the soil since spring, held moisture longer than the overgrazed pastures around him. While Ray Ketterman's bottom ground was cracking and his fescue had gone dormant and brown, Leonard's rotating paddocks were still showing green. Not growing fast, not lush, but alive and standing. The root systems that had been given time to go deep were reaching moisture that the shallow, repeatedly grazed roots of a continuous pasture couldn't find. He pulled his cows off the driest paddocks and let them rest. He shortened his rotation. He watched his grass heights daily. He cut his cow numbers for a week by moving 6 of the younger cows temporarily to a small lot with hay rather than stress the recovering paddocks beyond what they could handle. He did not panic. He adjusted. By September, the drought broke. A week of steady rain came through, and the paddocks responded in a way that surprised even Leonard. The grass came back faster than it should have, faster, he thought, than the same rain on the same land would have produced 2 years earlier. The soil was doing something different now. He could feel it when he walked it. The way you can feel the difference between dead ground and ground that's working. He wrote in his notebook, "Soil biological activity visibly different from baseline. This is not the same land it was in March." He was right, it wasn't. When October came and the cattle markets opened up and neighbors started sorting and selling, Leonard's cows had done something that 18 cows on 23 acres in a drought year in the Kentucky Hill Country were not supposed to do. They were in the best condition of any year he could remember. Body condition scores that should have dropped in a drought year had held. The August stress that usually shrank the margins on fall sales hadn't happened. Ray Ketterman sold early because he had to. His pastures couldn't support his herd, and he'd burned through his hay supply hauling bales to keep cows that were losing weight anyway. He sold in August at the summer price, which was low, because everyone else in the county was also selling early for the same reason. The market was flooded with thin cattle, and the prices showed it. Leonard sold in October. His cattle were in condition. The fall market was hungry because the summer liquidation had pulled supply forward, and the buyers who showed up at the sale barn that October were competing against each other. Amos Whitfield, who had been watching quietly all summer from his side of the ridge, came by in November. He didn't call ahead. He just pulled into the lane one morning and sat in his truck for a moment before getting out. The way a man does when he's not quite sure how to start a conversation he'd talked himself out of having 3 times already. He walked the paddocks with Leonard for almost an hour without saying much. He looked at the grass, he looked at the soil, he kicked at the ground in a few spots, and nodded slowly to himself. He asked a couple of questions about the wire setup and the rotation schedule, and Leonard answered them straight. Finally, Amos said, "I want to try a piece of this in the spring." Leonard said he'd help him set it up. "You're not worried I'll figure it out and compete with you?" Leonard looked at him. "Amos," he said, "if every farm in this county had grass like that, the whole county's better off. You're not my competition, you're my neighbor." Amos went quiet at that. Then he said, "Gary Pruitt's been saying your numbers don't add up." "Gary can come look at the numbers," Leonard said. "I've got 11 months of them in a notebook." Gary did not come look at the numbers, but two other farmers did. Earl Braddock, from up on Copperhead Road, who'd been struggling with his bottom pastures for 3 years, and a young woman named Heather Sorrell, who'd just taken over her family's place after her father's health declined and was trying to figure out what she was walking into. Heather had found Leonard's name through the extension office, which had quietly started mentioning his results to people who called with pasture problems. Leonard spent a Saturday morning walking both of them through everything: the record-keeping, the paddock layout, the decision rules for when to rest and when to graze, the signs in the grass that told you what the soil was doing. He gave them each a copy of his paddock map and his rotation schedule. He answered every question twice. Heather Sorrell stood at the gate of his best-recovered paddock and said, "My dad would have wanted to see this." Leonard said, "Then make sure he hears about it." The following spring, Earl Braddock set up a 7-paddock rotation on his 20-acre bottom ground. Amos Whitfield converted 12 acres on the south-facing slope that had always been his worst producer. Heather Sorrell took on the whole farm in one go, 24 acres, 10 paddocks, and a spiral notebook she'd bought specifically for the purpose. Gary Pruitt did not change his system, but he stopped making comments at Decker's Feed and Supply, which Leonard figured was its own kind of statement. The county extension agent, a careful, methodical man named Dennis Faherty, who didn't endorse things he hadn't seen with his own eyes, drove out to Leonard's farm in July of the following year and spent 3 hours asking questions. At the end of it, he said he was going to recommend the approach to the next Soil and Water Conservation District meeting and ask whether there was interest in a demonstration site. Leonard said that was fine. He didn't say he'd told them so. He didn't use the word vindication. He was, by nature, a man who measured things and noted them in a notebook and moved on to the next measurement. But that evening, after Dennis Faherty's truck had turned back onto the county road, Leonard walked out to the paddock nearest the barn. The one that had been the worst, the one that had been bare dirt and thistle when this whole thing started, and he stood there in the late afternoon light and looked at the grass. It was ankle-deep and even, and the kind of green that takes years to grow back into ground that's been beaten down. He didn't take a picture. He didn't call anyone. He just stood there for a while, the way a man stands when something he believed in, quietly and without much support, has turned out to be exactly as true as he knew it was. Then he went inside and wrote in his notebook, "Year 2 begins. Hold what works. Learn what doesn't. This land isn't done yet." He was right about that, too. I keep thinking about the moment Leonard got down on one knee in that first paddock and looked at the roots. He didn't take a photo. He didn't call anyone. He just put the grass back carefully and stood up and kept going. That image has stayed with me longer than almost anything else in this story. There's a kind of cause and effect at work in Leonard's story that I think we miss when we're too focused on the ending. We see the October sale, the fat cattle, the good price, and we call it a success story. But the real chain of events started much earlier, in the decisions Leonard made when nothing was working yet, when the paddock looked like a bad haircut, when Gary Pruitt was making comments at the feed store, when the drought hit and everyone around him was selling early and cutting losses. Every outcome he got in the fall was the direct result of something he chose to do, or chose not to do, months before. That's not luck. That's cause and effect playing out exactly the way it was always going to, for anyone disciplined enough to stay in the chain long enough to reach the other end. What strikes me about Leonard, and I mean this honestly, not as a compliment, but as an observation, is that he had the kind of integrity that doesn't require an audience. He kept the notebook when nobody was checking it. He measured the grass heights in paddocks that still looked rough. He held when his instincts probably told him to intervene. That consistency between what he believed and what he actually did, day after day with no one watching, is rarer than people admit. Most of us perform our values when someone might notice. Leonard practiced his when no one was looking, and that distinction is exactly why the land responded to him differently than it responded to everyone else who'd farmed it before. And then there's the intelligence of his approach, not the book knowledge, though he had that too, but the specific kind of thinking that says, before I act, I need to understand what's actually happening here. He spent months reading before he spent $1 on wire. He built a system of observation before he built anything in the ground. He let the data tell him what to do, instead of telling the data what he wanted to hear. When the drought came, he adjusted the rotation instead of doubling down on a plan that wasn't working anymore. That's not stubbornness dressed up as confidence. That's real thinking, the kind that stays honest under pressure. But what I come back to most is the persistence. Not the dramatic kind, not someone gritting their teeth against the odds in some movie poster moment. Leonard's persistence was quieter and harder than that. It was showing up on week 7 when the paddock still looked rough and writing "hold" in a notebook and meaning it. It was answering Gary's question 7 times with going all right, without elaborating, without defending himself, without needing the argument to go his way before he could keep working. He didn't need to win the conversation. He needed to tend the land, and those are 2 completely different projects. I think about the farmers who came after, Earl Braddock, Amos Whitfield, Heather Sorrell standing at that gate saying her father would have wanted to see this. Leonard didn't set out to change the county. He set out to fix his own ground. But when a person does something real, with rigor and patience and a genuine respect for how things actually work, the effects don't stay contained. They move. That's not a lesson I can prove. It's just something I've come to believe after watching enough people like Leonard do quiet, difficult, honest work, and then watching what happens to the ground around them. The land isn't done yet. Leonard wrote that himself. I believe him.